Um, I am, Dr. Roxanne Richards, just to let you know a little bit about myself. And this is a part of a new initiative that we're supporting our immigrant community. We started a series of talks and presentations to support the mental health of immigrants. The first installment was actually on mental health generally of our immigrants and just really helping them with supportive strategies to help their well-being. And this is the second installment in the series. And the focus today is going to be on the financial health of Black immigrants. And we are really excited to start this event. We have a very, very special guest in our midst, a well sought after individual. He is none other than Yannick Diouf, and he is an author. He is a financial expert in the field. He's also one of the co-founders of On DocuBlack Network, and he actually was he started that network while he was at the University of Maryland in 2015 as a student. So he has been doing quite a lot over the years, and he has been an immigrant for the past, I believe, 2 decades. He came to the United States with his family from Senegal. So we are so delighted to have such an expert in our midst today and for him to share so much support that we need, and for everyone to hear a little bit more of ways in which we can actually be living a very financial, fruitful life. So I'm just gonna start by just handing over and welcoming Yannick at this time. Welcome, Yannick.
Thank you, Roxanne. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, all righty. So I'm just going to shoot with some buzzing questions that I think we might have in mind. But Yannick is going to do a job of really exploring and helping us sharing with his expert knowledge. So the first question that I want to ask Yannick, what really influenced the work that you have done with immigrants?
Yeah, great question. So, as you mentioned, I was one of the co-founders for Undocu Black, and that was in 2015 alongside with Jamie and a few other folks like Jonathan. And prior to that, I was actually involved in the Maryland Dream Act campaign. So that was part of my first involvement in the immigrants' rights movement. And so after a
Mm-hmm.
few years of really doing the underground work and organizing and going door to door and campaigning, I ended up getting in touch with some of the folks that we just discussed, and we ended up starting Undocumented Black with a really where the focus was specifically allocating resources for Black and undocumented immigrants. I myself, while I was going through school and just kind of living in the country, I saw there was a lack of resources for immigrants, but specifically Black immigrants because we were somewhat invisible and we were just
Yes.
assumed to be part of the normal kind of, you know, Black citizens, and have the privilege of that, but that wasn't the case. So and that was kind of what inspired me, just not only from my experience, but also just seeing the lack of resources for us.
Yes, absolutely. That's great. And we're so proud of the work that you have been doing, Yannick.
Thank you.
And hopefully, this will be something that will enlighten other persons to take on these roles and challenges to support our immigrants. And Yannick, I would like to ask you as well, could you define for us from your experience and expertise what financial wellness is? And
Yes.
specifically for immigrants, what does that really look like?
Yeah. I think you can ask 100 different people and they can give you different answers based on what they value. And so this is one of those situations where the best answer is it depends. But in my
Yes.
opinion, there are general things that you can hit to really help you be successful with respect to financial wellness, right? So the first thing I would say is knowing how much money is coming and going.
Mhm.
The second thing I would say is living as much as humanly possible below your means, right? Making sure that, for example, if you're bringing in $3,000, that you're not spending $3,000 a month, right? That you're spending maybe 25, 2,400.
Mhm.
Um, and you're able to have margin every month, meaning the difference between how much income you have versus how much your expenses are. So like I mentioned in that example, you bring in 3,000 a month and you
Yes.
spend 2,500 a month, your margin is $500. And that $500 is one of the most powerful things because now you have the option to do so many things and hit your goals. For example,
Mhm.
going to the next point I was going to make, the third point is having an emergency fund. You can use that $500 to continuously build your emergency fund because
Mhm.
a lack of emergency fund is what prevents people from having options, whether it be leaving their job or taking advantage of some investment or whatever the case may be. Which leads me to my fourth point
Mhm.
is thinking about what it looks like to invest your money, right? Primarily, when we
Yes.
think about investments, we typically think about stocks and bonds, but there are other ways of investing, such as gold
Yes.
or buying property, whether it be domestically or internationally. But the idea of investing is to have capital that you're able to put in so that it can grow and work for you and give you a bigger return in the future, right? You don't want to be sitting on too much capital because inflation will erode the value of it. And so the fourth point is investing. And then the
Yes.
last point, which and then the point of investment is also to grow wealth, right? And but the last and fifth point I will say is boundaries. You can do all these things and be very successful at
Yes.
keeping your money, tracking it, investing it, and you're
Yes.
growing and you don't have any boundaries. It's just gonna fly away,
Yeah.
right? Like
Absolutely.
we as immigrants, we have, a savior's complex, if you will. And
Yes.
so having clear boundaries about what you're willing and not willing to do, what you can and can't do, is
Mhm.
going to serve you very well in the long term and make it more sustainable for you to not only take care of yourself, but to give to others. So, just to recap, the first point is knowing how much money is coming in and out. The second is living well below your means. Third one is setting up an emergency fund, ideally 3 to 6 months, if not even more, depending on your situation. Fourth, I would say investing, right? Hopefully to grow wealth. And
Yes.
the last one being setting up boundaries. Now, like I said, you could have so many different types of opinions and it just depends on your situation. But I
Yes.
believe based on my experience, not only with my life, but with others that I've spoke to and helped, these these points that I just listed are what I think would give you most people the most chance at success.
Thanks, Yannick. I mean, that is so amazing just to hear all of that outlined. And I hope, guys, that you were taking notes. Wow. Especially when you mentioned the part about boundaries. I think that's the most difficult part for many individuals, but definitely it is something very important for us to consider,
Oh yeah. We
especially if
run
we're
we run
trying
on
to.
guilt as immigrants. We run on guilt sometimes.
Yes. Yes.
Because you have to think about the emotional journey of leaving your country and your family coming to the States and 99% of the time it's because of economic prosperity and
Yes.
opportunity. And you have this sense of obligation, many of us, to send money back home, which is perfectly
Right.
fine and well, but it has to be done in a sustainable, thoughtful way
Yes.
and not through this sense of martyrdom. Because what's going to
Exactly.
happen is, and what happens oftentimes is, if you give too much to people, especially people who don't deserve or who don't appreciate it, what
Yes.
happens is
Wow.
over time you start to build resentment, and
Yes.
resentment erodes relationships and the love that you may have. And it's
Oh
not
my God.
sustainable, right? And so having boundaries and the ability to disappoint
Mhm.
people is a big, big skill. And me,
Yes.
not only do I have that ability, but I take pleasure in it.
Yes. Yes.
I take great pleasure.
I think that's so empowering. We really have to learn that one, just to
Yes.
learn to disappoint people.
Yeah. Saying no doesn't mean you don't love that person. It just
Yeah,
means you value the relationship enough to prioritize yourself and your well-being. That way you'll be able to give more in the long term. It's all about sustainability.
Yes, absolutely. I love those. I love those. Awesome. All right. So we're learning so much. Let's see if we could talk a little bit about Yannick. To what extent do you actually believe or financial health affects our mental health, and
Mhm.
vice versa?
I think
You know.
that because our finances impact every single part of our lives, it is something that we have to be very conscious of. And if we're not, then other parts of our lives can erode. I'll give you an example where, and I think I already mentioned this, but for the most part, I grew up undocumented in this country, hence why I was part of the co-founders of Undocu Black.
Yes.
And part of that experience was not being able to work and not being able to afford the basic necessities. And
Right.
there's a sense of helplessness that comes with that because you're not able to attain any type of capital in the more
Yes.
traditional ways. And a lot of people don't get it because people are oblivious about the immigration system, especially if you're black. They just tell you to
Ye-
apply for citizenship, like just stupid suggestions, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so I remember very vividly being like sitting at home and knowing that I could contribute so much to a business or whatever the case may be, but I just wasn't able to because I didn't have a social security or a work permit or whatever the case may be, right? So
Right.
that led to a lot of the feeling of just like angst and
Mm-hmm.
sadness and just helplessness.
Yes.
And so not having the ability to empower yourself, not
Yes.
having the
Yes.
ability to afford things is which again ties into money, but also
Mm-hmm.
your mental health. It was just a lack of power that
Yes.
I felt. And I'll say especially being a man, and a lot of men feel their measurement and their value as a man is directly tied with the ability to provide and bring
Yes.
in money. I think it just exacerbated situations.
Yes.
Granted, I was like, 14, 15, 16, whatever the case may be.
Yes.
It still had that tie to it. So I think that eventually I learned the game, and the game was you got to bend the rules, right?
Yes.
You gotta work for cash or whatever the case may be. But
Yes.
getting involved with the immigrants' rights movement really helped me to kind of take that power and do something proactive. But to answer your question, I think it's heavily tied in just because we need money for everything. And so just
Yeah.
being conscious about why you're feeling those emotions and how it's tied to money, hopefully, it helps with how you process that.
Exactly. So, and and if I might add to that, a lot of the challenges that people face today, experts have really spoken about money matters as being one of the leading stressors. And as we know, that can cause many mental health concerns and with depression, anxiety. And as you mentioned, I love the idea of speaking about the perspective of men sometimes wanting, they have the desire to really provide for their families and homes, and if they're not feeling as if they're doing that, then that can really impact their mental health. And there are so
Yes.
many factors to it. So this is just valuable information, and yes, something that we really have to be alert and aware of, as well.
Mhm.
So, and I just want to ask another question, Yannick. Just can you share with us some of the main factors that affect the financial health of immigrants,
Mhm.
and how can immigrants maintain financial health given the many unique challenges that they face?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would mention is not knowing the system, like the system of healthcare. This,
Yes,
can you hear me? Can you hear me
yes,
well? Okay. I would say the first thing is
yes,
not knowing the system, right? Not being familiar with how things work, how the healthcare
yes,
system work, taxes, paying taxes,
yes,
filing. So just getting to know how the system works is one of the main obstacles because you also may not be aware of the resources that are out there to help you. The
Yes.
second thing I mentioned earlier is this savers mentality and martyr sense of martyrdom and just
Mhm.
sacrificing yourself to either for your kids or for people back home. What I'm arguing for is a balanced approach because when you
Yeah.
go to extremes, it's not sustainable. If you're too frugal and don't share, you're not giving enough back to your community and your family.
Yes.
And if
Yeah.
you are doing too much of that, you don't have enough for yourself. So having a balanced approach is typically the right approach. And then the lastly thing I would say is this tension that we have between the community and individualism. A lot of us as Black immigrants, we come from community-oriented countries and from
Yes.
a community-oriented value system. And in the US, it's very individualistic. And so there's a tension there that we try to reconcile based on our values. And so it's going to look different for everybody, but understanding where that is coming from and understanding what your values are in order to choose which parts of you wants to be more individualistic and which parts of you wants to be more community oriented. So I think that last piece is something that I've seen a lot of people struggle with. But I would say those are the three things that I would hit on. Just knowing about the system, being aware of like why you have this, some of us may have this savior's complex, and then also lastly, the tension between community and individualism.
Awesome. Amazing. And I realized that, especially when you speak about the system, um, it is, it's something that a lot of people, when they come here, they really don't know there's a system and you
That's right.
can work with this system. And that in itself causes a lot more tension, anxiety, fear, feelings of helplessness, and can, really impact our mental health and well-being. So happy that we're able to hear a little bit more about, the fact that we could navigate some of these difficulties, Yannick.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. All right. Okay. So tell us, Yannick, what are some resources that are most accessible to someone who doesn't know how to start getting help in their finances?
Yeah. So I would say that first, it can be a bit overwhelming because there's a lot of information out there. The approach that I would give is choose a specific area that you want to focus on that's most important to you and get information and advice from different sources regarding that specific topic. So for example, if you are shopping for SUV, make sure that you have different sources about that SUV. So relating to finances, you can go on YouTube. I love YouTube. It's got a lot of different information, but there's also a lot of piss in the water, as people say, right? So be careful about what you ingest. Books are also great. I'm a big fan of audiobooks. I recommend obviously my book, but then I also recommend a few others that I've really enjoyed. There's a book, one of my favorites is a book by Ramit Sethi, and I can send you the text afterwards, but it's called I Will Teach You to Be Rich. Really good insight on how to logistically go through each step for every part of your life. So I'm a big fan of that one. His name is Ramit Sethi. The second one is Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Goes into the how we think about money, how it impacts our psychology, especially with investing. And then the last one is called The Algebra of Wealth by Scott Galloway. And his is very much so focused on like real life examples, etc. Now, all three really focus on similar approach, which I also agree with, which they're not a get rich quick scheme. They're not, it's none of that, right? I don't believe in get
Yes.
rich quick schemes because it's too much risk for most people and you're
Yeah.
going to fail. Rather, they're systemic approaches to not only taking care of yourself, but building wealth for you and your family over time. So I would recommend those. So YouTube, books, and then the last thing I would say is just conversations with friends and family. Oftentimes money is a taboo topic for us to discuss. And so prioritizing those conversations with friends and family to make sure that you're able to knowledge share about best practices and just put some things out on the table. Oftentimes, when you tell your family that you have certain goals, they're more likely to support you. For example, if you're trying to get out of debt or whatever the case may be, they might not pressure you, or they might understand when you decline to go out to dinner or whatever the case may be because you're trying to save money. So that would be the
Mhm.
last thing I would mention is just conversations with friends and family.
Great, great.
Mhm.
It tells us that there is really hope for many persons. We have to really strategize, and we have to access, as Yannick just mentioned, so many different resources. And so it's really good and interesting to hear all of that. All right, so let's see if we could just go along. Yannick, can you just share with us about your book,
Mhm.
um, Dundal?
Yes, yes.
I want us to hear a lot more. And why should someone grab? I know why. I grabbed a copy.
Yeah.
So why should someone listening to you grab a copy of this book, your book?
I
Tell
think
us
that
more.
if you, first of all, the book applies to, I would say, 80% of the people, but especially if you're a Black immigrant, you should definitely
Yes.
get a copy if you are looking to have an understanding of how the United States works and operates from a very high level and how we got here in the first place in with respect to our system. And if you are looking to have a holistic approach to your financial management plan, right? I focus a lot of on kind of some of the quantitative aspects of dealing with money, but then also some of the qualitative stuff. Like I mentioned, boundaries is a big one, is one of my favorite chapters because that's something that we all struggle with the most because it's very nuanced and
Mhm.
it's juicy, right?
Mhm.
Like having the ability to tell your mother no. Whoa, can you imagine? God
Yes.
forbid, God forbid. It's like it's like, oh, you don't love me? Like to me, that's just juicy. And so it's a holistic approach. It's similar to the other books. However, it does not dive as deep into specific topics as some of these other books because my book is only about 250 pages. So I wanted to keep it to the point, condensed, and and hopefully make it more accessible. But one of the things that I did my best in doing is explaining some of these more complicated theories and you know uh, terms in the more simplistic way, right? So hopefully it's easier to understand. So if you're trying to have a better understanding of how money works in the system, and especially if you're new to the country, it is a great resource.
Great. Yeah. And we will certainly have a lot more information um, posted below for you if you're, I think it's a great resource, and it's definitely something that we have to grab, especially for newcomers and people who are trying to navigate the new world that they're living in and the crisis
Absolutely.
that they face, challenges that they face. So,
Absolutely.
um,
And I put my website on the chat. I don't know if everybody saw it, but it's just yannickdiouf.com, and you'll be
okay,
able to order books from there as well. Or if anyone is interested in having me do any engagements, you can also do that through there as well.
awesome, awesome,
Thank you,
great.
Jamie.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So, can you also share with us, Yannick, what's ahead for the future? And can you tell us the work that you're doing and how much more work do you want to do?
I don't want to do any work, but there's a there's a difference between what I want to do and what I'm gonna do. What I want to do is sit at the beach in Senegal. Um, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of need everywhere, and I have a lot of different passions. Like you mentioned, I've been working in the housing finance sector for the past almost a decade now. So I'm very passionate about housing, very passionate about personal finance. I'm also passionate about soccer, but I'm injured and I'm washed up and old, so I can't play as much
Wow.
as I want to. But
Okay.
but yeah, there's always a lot of work to do. I think, I'm always on the lookout for where the need is. And I think for now, what I see the need being is just having more um honest and candid and nuanced conversations surrounding money, and specifically as it relates to us Black immigrants, right? Because I think the space needs more attention,
Mhm.
and hopefully, and this is just my viewpoint and my take of this, and I'm hoping that other people will also step in and have their own perception and their own take, even if it differs from me. I'm, really happy about that. So but yeah, I'm just gonna kind of continue doing what I'm doing, and seeing where the opportunities are.
Great. And yeah, there's so much work out there and people. This is well needed information, and you're definitely a resource for this community. So I'm happy that you're really on board and excited and passionate for what
Absolutely.
you're doing. Great. So I think it's the time for us to ask questions. We have the opportunity to just type up our questions in the chat, ask Yannick maybe a question or two. So I'm just gonna open up the next few minutes for questions and answers. So go ahead and shoot your questions.
All right, so we have one here, one question for Yannick. What is your opinion on buying versus renting as an immigrant?
That's an excellent question. It depends. Like most answers in finance, it depends. I'm a big fan of renting. I'm also a big fan of buying, and it really depends on what the numbers look like and ultimately what your goals are. The one thing I didn't mention in all of this, a lot of the decisions that you make when it comes to your finances start off with knowing yourself, who you are, and where your values are. Because once you have a clarity into those things, everything else falls into place. When you're doing your budget, you're able to allocate based on your values because you know what you care about. When you're thinking about your 10-year, 15, 20-year plan, it makes it a lot easier to understand what is most important to you, and therefore what you should prioritize. And so starting off with where your values are and what your goals are is the most important part. And then determining what is the best mechanism to achieve those values. It could be that the best mechanism is renting. It could be the best mechanism is buying. Or it could be the best mechanism is staying at your parents' house. Literally everything. I'm somebody who works in housing sector. I don't believe that every single person should buy a house. I think that's a ridiculous notion. Yes, one of the best ways to build wealth is through getting a mortgage and a house, but it has to be done responsibly. It has to be done in a way that's sustainable, and it has to be done in a way that you can afford it. If you run the numbers, and there's plenty of calculators out online, if you run the numbers and they say that it makes this house is overpriced for you to get a mortgage, it makes more sense for you to rent it, even if it's for 5, 10 years, and the difference that you would be saving, you could then invest it or put it somewhere else, then that's what makes the most sense for you. Then that's what makes the most sense for you. Also, you have to know what comes with each decision, right? No matter what you do, there's going to be trade-offs. That's just life, right? There's always going to be an opportunity cost. When you buy and own a mortgage, whether you're buying it as an investment property or somewhere that you live, there's going to be some level of things that come with that. Are you willing and able to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and fix a water pump for your tenant? Yes or no? Are you willing and able to pay $10,000 for a new roof? Yes or no? If some of those answers are no, then maybe lean more towards the renting route, right? Um, but ultimately it's about whether or not the numbers make sense for you to rent or buy, and whether or not you want to live that lifestyle, and are they in line with your long-term goals. I'm not somebody that believes that everybody should rent or everybody should buy. It's very nuanced, and I would recommend Ramit's book again because he dives a little bit more deeper into that than I do in my book. But there's plenty of online calculators, and then there's a bunch of YouTube things. But I would steer clear away from people who sensationalize and say you're wasting your money by renting. I think that's horseshit. I think that's stupid. Okay. I think you need to look at the details and understand who you are and do what makes sense for you.
Thank you, Yannick. I did read your book, and one of the things I appreciate is that you emphasize that not everything, it's not a one size fits all
That's right.
for finances. So yeah, I appreciate that notion. Another question is, how do we build financial wealth for retirement and the next generation?
I got triggered. Um, I think the retirement question in this country is it's very loaded. One, Social Security and the funding behind that, there's question marks around if we're going to have enough money for that. Two, a lot of people don't have savings to deal with a $500 emergency, let alone retirement that's coming up in 10, 15, 20 years. In my opinion, first and foremost, anybody having a baby who has a child needs to immediately open up a custodial account for your child and maybe put $20 a month in there, right? And by the time they're 18 or 20, they're going to be able to hopefully have that either to use for college or business or whatever the case may be. But essentially, that could be potentially a retirement account. And I think if every one of us had that by the time we're 50s, 60s, it would have grown just enough. And even just putting $20 makes a big difference. But I think the question around retirement is, again, going back to the idea of knowing yourself and your values and what does retirement look like. Some people want to retire here. You have to ask yourself what kind of lifestyle you want to live. You have to ask yourself what your goals are. Do you want to retire back home? How much is that going to cost? There's so many different factors to determining what that number looks like. And then from that, you work backwards, right? There are general frame of references, like for example, the 4% rule. So let's say that you plan on having a cost of living of about $50,000. So if you take $50,000 and divide it by 4%, so 50,000 divided by 0.04, you'll get a number that will tell you exactly how much you need to have saved in order to live for 25 years, I believe, is the number, right? I think maybe it's like 1.2 million or 1.5 million or something like that, right? So that's a general framework, but it doesn't take into consideration the fact that you might have kids. It doesn't take into consideration that you might have health costs or whatever the case may be. So, I mean, we could talk for 2 hours about retirement, but it's extremely dense and nuanced. There's a lot of moving parts. But in general, I would say know what your retirement looks like, have a clear window of how much time you think you're gonna need, and then hopefully you can follow steps to start saving up for that in a consistent manner. So it's a lot, but that's kind of, I would say, the general frame.
Okay, I believe this question is for Dr. Richards. Someone is wondering, what are some of the ways or tools immigrants can tap into to protect their mental health in light of the ongoing elections?
Yeah, I need this too.
Okay, that's a very, very interesting and question that we really need help with, because so many persons have been asking those questions of lately. It's really intense. Sometimes we have to be aware of what's happening, but we have to also be alert, and we have to be connected with our own mental health to see what we can actually take on. For some persons, too much of maybe the news, maybe it's something that you will cause you to be a lot more anxious and worried and overwhelmed. So you have to ensure that you're evaluating your own self and know what you could handle. It's important that you process how you're feeling. So make sure that you're in your safe space where you're actually expressing how you're feeling, whether you're worried, overwhelmed, anxious, and whatever the case is. You have your community. I think that's very, very helpful and useful for so many persons, particularly now. It helps to ease the tension. That's another thing, but we have to make sure that we're practicing our self-care. We have to make sure that we take out ourselves out of anything that's too much or too stressful, and we have our time where we're actually in relaxed mode. So we're eating right, we're exercising, and we're doing self-soothing exercise, and we're doing these things, self-soothing activities, and we're doing these things routinely so that we do not become overwhelmed with everything that we're seeing or hearing that's happening. So those are some important things, or some easy ones that I think we could actually use.
Thank you. And I would also suggest that everyone check out Dr. Richards' YouTube page. There are several videos on there about de-stressing and self-care and so forth. So we'll drop that in the chat as well.
Thank you.
One more question for Yannick. If you have a lot of debt as an undocumented person, how can you achieve financial health?
Yeah. So I have a whole chapter on managing debt, and regardless of how much debt you have, I've seen people manage it very well and get out of it. It just depends on how much you're willing to sacrifice to get to that point. Just like with anything else, it requires diligence, discipline, sacrifice. And so, I mean, there's different approaches, I would say. It just depends on what makes the most sense for you. There's the avalanche approach where, you're taking on the smaller size debt, like, the $200 credit card debt, and then you pay that off, and then you move on to the larger size debt. I think the most important thing with debt management is being able to create the margin. So going back to what we talked about in the beginning of the webinar,
Mm-hmm.
your revenue and the money you bring in minus your expenses is the margin that you have every month to work with and accomplish your goals. So whether you're trying to buy a new car, get rid of debt, create an emergency fund, that margin and being able to reduce your expenses is what's going to help you tackle your debt and do so every month. So once you handle the margin piece, making sure you also have an emergency fund, because if you don't have an emergency fund, when something comes up and you have to take care of that something, now you're letting that debt build up again, or you might even go into more debt, which I've seen a lot of people happen. Even with debt consolidation, you might be able to consolidate all your debt into a lower interest rate. But what tends to happen to a lot of people is, because they don't have an emergency fund, something comes up, they now have to take on even more debt, and that keeps piling up. And so creating margin, which just means reducing your expenses compared to your revenue, and having an emergency fund, I would say, are the two things you want to prioritize when managing debt. And if you're able to do that consistently and then pay it off very, very aggressively, you should be able to get out of it. But it's a question of how much you're willing to sacrifice. I believe in you.
All right. Next question is, can we buy a home being if we're undocumented?
Yes. It depends also. There are different ways of doing so. There are some banks who are willing to work with DACA recipients, and those mortgages can at times be sold in the secondary market, which just means to investors, and that allows for more loans to be originated. So there is some precedence for that. And I think that there's also what's called a manual underwriting. And I believe that that's also a way that many banks go about underwriting for undocumented immigrants. But however, it just depends on the where you are in the country, what banks you have access to, whether or not they have the appetite to do that and the operations to do that. If you are interested in getting a mortgage and you're undocumented, make sure that you do research, make sure you try and get references, look at ratings and see what other people's experience has been. If you have DACA, it makes it a little bit easier to go about that route. You can also tag team with somebody else who may be a citizen. So if you have a parent or a sibling or whatever the case may be, you can come in together and say, we're both getting this mortgage, or you can combine finances, etc. And that may help you with the ability to qualify for a mortgage. So there's different ways, but I would say just make sure you do research. Obviously, I can't give recommendations, but make sure you do research on what experiences that other people have had working with certain banks that have been documented working with certain banks to get a mortgage.
Okay, and this one isn't a question, but it says, "Hi, Yannick, I have a copy of your book."
Yes.
And another one says, "Just saying that this is great advice." Thank you for that.
Awesome.
And then we have two other questions. And one is, "I have $50,000 now in my bank account. Is that the best place for it?"
No. Oh, sorry. I got triggered. It depends. The answer is it depends. That's my official answer. You have to look at your entire picture. When money is sitting and not growing, either with interest or through investing, the value of that 50,000 is being eroded with inflation if it's not growing. Ideally, you would want to put it maybe in a money market or high yield savings account. But overall, I think you have to look at your entire picture, right? Start off with your goals, what you're trying to accomplish, and then make sure that you have at least 3 to 6 months of emergency fund. If $50,000 is your 3 to 6 months emergency fund, then that might be the right answer for you. But maybe that's a little bit aggressive, right? If maybe out of that 50,000, maybe you actually only need about 15 in your emergency fund, just sitting in your savings account. Maybe that's good enough because you want to be able to access it very quickly if something pops up. You want to be able to access it very quickly. And then you take the rest of that 30 or 35,000 and either you put it in a high yield savings account or you put it in stock investments or you decide to do some invest in commodities or you decide to invest in real estate. There are different ways to invest your money, but the idea is to allow it to you want to hedge against inflation and protect it from being eroded by increasing inflation, which we've been dealing with for the past couple of years. So you run the numbers a little bit, understand how much you actually need in your emergency fund, and then decide to invest that money elsewhere. We could talk about that for a long time, but I would say that's the general premise of it. Yeah.
Okay, one more question. Would you advise starting a business as an immigrant? Are there risks involved?
There's risks. There's always risk involved. There's risk involved if you do it. There's risk involved if you don't do it, right? You could risk regret. You could risk not having a second source of income if you don't do it. If you do it, there's risk of failure, right? There's risk. There's just risk in anything you do or don't do. There's always risk. So I think that's not the right question. The right question is what your values are and what risk are you willing to tolerate based on your values, right? And so if you are somebody that is passionate about that business, if you are somebody that you're willing to work hard, because starting a business or a nonprofit, you're putting in the 60 hours, 70, 80 hours a week, right? If you're somebody that is willing to do that, if you're somebody that is not gonna be defeated, if you enjoy having this like nebulous and uncertainty with what to do next, if you can manage that, then that's something you should go for. But when it comes to taking risk and doing all those things, it really starts from within and with yourself. You have to ask yourself these very important questions and ask yourself honestly. Not everybody's built to be an entrepreneur, and there are people, and that's perfectly fine. There are people who would rather have a very stable job, stable paycheck, knowing that that's consistently coming in. And to me, that is perfectly fine. And other people who are, hey, I want to run the show. I want to do that, right? And that's perfectly fine. I'm personally in between those two. I have a little bit of both. But to answer the question about the risk, there's going to be risk no matter what you do. If you stay inside or you go outside, there's going to be risk, So
Wow, we have a lot of questions today. Thank you all for sending them. We
great
just
question.
got another one. Someone said, Dr. Richards, how would you advise someone that had a traumatic experience from their job to still operate professionally and efficiently?
Okay, so that's a very good question because it's tempting not to operate professionally if you had a bad experience with your job, something traumatic that's going on, because this affects your mental health and well-being. So it's easy to really behave maybe out of character. But it's important to try to maintain your integrity in your job, your workspace. But I would say have a plan. If it's becoming too toxic and you're not going to be able to function, then you have to have a plan to get out. Also, you have to have a plan in place. Make sure that you're taking your mental health very important. You're taking it as priority. You're putting yourself first. So make sure that you get into a space where you could get some professional help. So you might need a therapist, you might need a psychologist, just to kind of work through some of those issues that are going on. Because what you don't want to happen is for you to have all these serious issues when you leave that workspace, and you want to be able to function when you actually leave, right? So it's very important that you take those things into consideration, get the valued help that you do deserve, and make sure that you try to maintain professional behaviors, etc., while you're still there with a plan in mind.
Jamie, I'll also add document everything, right? If somebody's messing with you, whether it be colleague, boss's boss, make sure everything is documented. After a meeting, document, send an email saying, hey, this is what we discussed in our meeting. Please confirm email. Document the chat, document any type of engagement, good or bad, document, because most likely they're probably doing the same thing for you.
That's great. Good point.
Okay, so those are all the questions that we have. I will turn it back over to Dr. Richards to close.
Okay. All right. So this was really great, very empowering, very just enlightening. And I'm sure that you've all enjoyed the day today. And we're so thankful for our guest, Yannick. Thank you for being here and taking time out just to share
Absolutely.
and just to be a part of. And you're definitely a resource. And we're happy that we have you with us and on board. Thanks for all those who have joined in with us, and definitely for Undocky Black Network, who is in partnership with Hope Behavioral. We are so grateful for you. So guys, we'll have all the information there for you to get your valid resource and to make sure that you grab a copy of Yannick's book as well. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. See you soon. And we're going to be having upcoming series again. So look out, check out the new things that are coming up. We have other series as well.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Our pleasure.